Hello and welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast. This is a podcast to help you find peace with food and overcome disordered eating. And I'm Harriet Frew, aka the Eating Disorder Therapist. And I'm so excited to share with you all kinds of stories, tips, information and guest interviews to help you on your journey in finding peace with food. So today I'm talking all about mindset shifts and psychological work you need in eating disorder recovery. Now this is my part 2. I already recorded a part 1 to this, which was released last Wednesday. So do go back and listen to this one first. So I was going to just do a part 2, but then I think after writing this and then going on to record it today, I'm realizing that I'm probably going to need to do maybe a part 3 and even a part 4 because there is just so much to cover around this whole topic. So I've decided today to focus purely on emotions, as I think there is such a lot that we can talk about around this, and I think will be really, really helpful for you guys rather than trying to rush through too much information and to overwhelm you. So this episode is going to focus mainly on emotions, emotional intelligence, and how to develop a healthier relationship with your emotions. So before we sort of launch into that, I just want to say that eating disorder recovery is in part a psychological process. You know, if it was not a psychological process, you would just be able to look at a few posts on Instagram, eat a bit more, get into a regular eating pattern. It would be all about the food and you wouldn't need to probably go to therapy or do journaling or work on yourself. It would be so much more of a straightforward recovery. So, of course, it is about food and physical healing too, because if you're undernourished, you probably do need to eat more. If you're stuck in a diet binge cycle, you probably need support with your regular eating and balancing blood sugar. And it's also incredibly helpful to be neutralizing foods, not banning forbidding foods, etc., but moving closer to a more intuitive way of eating and self-trust in the body. So all of that, of course, is massively helpful. Now, behavioral changes will definitely provide a solid platform for healing and are a necessary part of the process. However, if you focus purely on the behavioral change without working on your mindset, your self-worth, your emotional intelligence, your thoughts, your relationships, your perfectionism, and more, you could be stuck in a very quasi-recovered place. And you might think, this is really frustrating. Recovery is not working for me. I'm eating the food, I'm doing the stuff, I'm meant to be feeling better, but I don't feel better. In fact, I'm kind of feeling worse, and I'm now feeling all the feelings that were numbed before, and life feels pretty overwhelming and hard, and I'm hugely tempted to revert to the old ways of coping. So if you recognize yourself here, you are not alone. Eating disorder recovery is more than focusing on food and establishing regular eating, etc., although of course that is very, very important. So if you do recognize yourself here, it is very normal sometimes that things will feel worse before they get better. So it's really important to hang on in there, really get support if you need it around the psychological side, and work through the kind of past trauma you need to work through, maybe work through understanding how your eating disorder has really helped you cope. Really work on the psychology and mindset side of things, because of actually ultimately this is going to get you to a fully healed, flourishing place where you actually genuinely feel so much better. I sometimes think quasi-recovery is the worst place ever, because you're almost behaviourally doing things differently, but your head is often in a worse place than it was before because you're in touch with all your emotions. So if you're in quasi-recovery and you recognise yourself here, the answer is not to go back to using the ED as coping. The answer is to get more support around the psychology. Okay, so don't give up on it. So in the podcast last week or earlier this week, I was talking about mindset psychological shifts, focusing mainly on 3 things. And that was, you can't just bury your past. Looking at our past is an important part of the recovery process. Number 2, working on ambivalence around change and shifting motivation. It's very, very normal that people feel in 2 minds about recovering from an eating disorder. That is normal. We work with that. And number 3, working towards rejecting diet culture and getting fully in your recovery lane. Okay, now I think we do live in a culture where we're inundated with so many messages, it's really important as part of recovery that we put the blinkers on, that we start to get much more grounded in our own values, in our own worth, and less on the kind of superficial values that are often sort of put onto us by the culture. So yeah, do go back and listen to that episode if you haven't already. So in this episode, we're going to be focusing on our emotions, our feelings. So when you have an eating disorder, you're often numbing, avoiding or distracting from your feelings. And this might be because you have certain things you don't want to think about. So maybe you've experienced some trauma, some abuse, some bereavement, some loss or pain. And maybe these emotions just feel quite difficult to feel and bear. Perhaps it all just feels too much. Maybe you're terrified of tuning in and feeling your emotions and feeling overwhelmed. And maybe you just feel so disconnected from your emotions. Like some people say, don't they? Like, I haven't cried for such a long time. I just can't access my emotions anymore. So I think it's important, to talk about why so many of us do deal with our emotions in this slightly unhealthy way. Because I guess as a culture, I'm talking more particularly like in the UK now, but I think this is probably relevant for many people kind of in Western culture. So historically, we have not been trained and conditioned to deal with emotions in an effective way. So in the UK, we very much have what's called the British stiff upper lip, and that was very much kind of the way people deal with things for a long time, particularly perhaps through the war and in the post-war years. So our grandparents and parents often felt they needed to create a front of everything being fine. You don't talk about how you feel. And I think, particularly in Britain as well, it's often been really important to portray a very good image to everyone around you. As long as you're kind of portraying this good image and you look like the perfect family, and it looks like when you're out in public that everyone's getting on and everyone is coping, etc., etc., that's where we've all often channeled a lot of our energy. And often what goes on behind closed doors is a completely different matter. But I think in British culture, there's a lot of kind of shame and embarrassment about kind of, the darker side of life and having difficult feelings. And it's all about sort of presenting this coping front, which obviously, human struggle is not realistic. And I think we have this expression in the UK as well, where it says, you don't wash your dirty linen in public. So there's a lot of kind of shame and embarrassment and, not wanting to kind of talk about things openly. Now, of course, this can be quite dysfunctional because as all human beings, we do suffer. And if we pretend we're just fine, the emotional baggage doesn't go away. It's often festering away, and we're kind of burying it. And it's like trying to stick a plaster over a gaping wound when we just try to kind of brush our emotions aside. So no wonder as well, I think, that people in the past just struggled massively with their mental health because they were sort of really encouraged and conditioned to just pretend everything was fine, bury it down, and push your emotions aside, and probably to cope in quite maladaptive ways because there was no other way of coping. So of course we need to be absolutely compassionate to previous generations because they are doing their best they could at the time, and they hadn't been parented in an emotionally validating way. Mental health wasn't a consideration, and many people had never been to therapy. So people are only operating from the place, that they are conditioned by. They can't do any better than that. So we can be compassionate, but we can also still acknowledge the hurts or lack of emotional care we might have received. So you could acknowledge your parents and your grandparents' limitations, so be compassionate to them, but you can still offer yourself real compassion and empathy if you recognise that your needs weren't met. And I think this is really important. I think, again, it's something that we often struggle with because people think, oh, I can't think anything negative about my parents or my grandparents. Again, there's this kind of real fear of sort of tapping into our negative emotion. But I just want to say to you that actually, all human beings are imperfect. We all have our strengths and our weaknesses. We're generally doing the best we can at the time, but we still mess up. And it's just important for us all to be able to kind of recognise this as well. No one is perfect, and we all experience the whole range of emotions. So let's talk a bit more about our early life and how our emotional environment at home has a profound impact on how we deal with emotions ourselves. So your ability to deal with your emotions in a healthy way will be impacted by your early experiences, of interacting with and seeing others close to you deal with their emotions. So as children, we're little sponges. We observe what's going on around us, and we tend to kind of copy others and emulate them because of, we sort of trust them to kind of keep us safe, and that's what we kind of learn because we're observing that. So if you grew up in an environment that was safe and calm, where there was time to listen to one another, at least some of the time, and where feelings were validated and accepted, then you're much more likely to be able to express your emotions, express your feelings openly, and take action to soothe or feel better. Now, in this environment, in this emotionally validating environment, if a child is upset, the parent will listen to the upset, maybe offer soothing by listening and understanding, and then the child then feels safe to express their feelings and can kind of move on with their day. And in this example, the child learns that it's okay to have feelings. Feelings are safe. Feelings can be expressed and managed healthily. Now, of course, this doesn't always happen though. Home environments can sometimes be abusive or traumatic, or simply as well too busy and chaotic for healthy emotional processing. Now, if you experienced a hostile environment with trauma or abuse, then understandably, this is going to have impacted how you deal with your feelings. And, if you're listening to this and you really recognise that there's perhaps, things that you haven't talked about, you haven't explored, and perhaps feel quite unsafe to explore, you might want to do that in the safety of therapy and counselling. Now, you don't have to have experienced trauma or abuse to still struggle with feelings. You might have come from a kind and caring home where you really know that you were loved, and maybe all your physical needs were met. However, the emotional component may have been lacking. And this will largely be down to your parents or caregivers only being able to offer you the emotional support they can based on their own lived experience. So if your parents' caregivers, your grandparents possibly did not do this for them, unless they've had therapy or done a great deal of personal development work, they're probably going to really struggle to do that for you. Now, as I mentioned, you might feel guilty for thinking about your family in a negative way or wrong for doing this. But life is complex, and I believe people are generally doing the best that they can at the time. Perfect parenting does not exist. So you can have compassion for how your parents or caregivers were coping due to their circumstances, while also acknowledging where your emotional needs were not met. Okay, so you can have those two things simultaneously. So I'm going to talk about now some of the common barriers in families in terms of dealing with emotions. So a common one is maybe that the child is told they're being silly and not to make a fuss. So if when you're expressing your anger, your sadness, your anxiety, if you're just told, actually, don't be silly, you're making a fuss about nothing, what the child will hear then is actually, my feelings don't matter. And the child then learns not to trust those feelings because of, if the adult around them hasn't been able to validate the feelings, the child thinks, well, why should I take this feeling seriously? Another way where feelings don't get dealt with helpfully is perhaps where the child is often given advice by the parent rather than being listened to. So being told what to do rather than the parent listening to the child's actual experience and hearing the feelings. Now, of course, perhaps when a child is quite young, they do need a lot of direction and gentle guidance from parents because otherwise, they'll be like running in the road and all kinds of things, wouldn't they? So, I'm not saying that parents shouldn't have some boundaries and kind of healthy limits. However, maybe particularly as the child's becoming a teenager and they're starting to think about, what subjects they want to study, what they want to do for their birthday, where they're going with their friends, all these kind of things. It's really important then that a parent starts to listen to the child, listen to what's important to them. Because if the child is not listened to but is always kind of given advice, the child loses trust in themselves and they will always look to others for the answers. So if they're about to make a decision, about what they're going to do about something, they will tend to always look to an adult or another friend or someone else to kind of guide them rather than developing that self-trust and listening to themselves. Okay, another way where emotions are not dealt with so helpfully at home is where the home environment is busy or stressfully chaotic with no space to talk about feelings. So maybe you come from a really large family, so there was always just like so much going on and lots of noise. And maybe your parents had to work 2 jobs and there were financial stresses, or they were caring for a loved one or an elderly relative or something. So maybe there's so much going on, there was just no space to talk about feelings. So again, people are kind of doing the best they can at the time, but it means maybe that your kind of feelings are getting overlooked. Another one can be if others in the family vent really loudly and openly and take up all the emotional space. So if you had a sibling maybe, or a parent who was always like really loud, really vocal, there was a lot of drama, then as a child you would have very much learned, well, I don't want to fill up any more of this emotional space, or maybe there is no emotional space for me. You might have kind of learned that you need to listen to other people's feelings and look after their emotions. So you keep quiet to keep the peace. But again, your emotions don't get validated. Sometimes this can happen as well in a family if you've had a sibling who has maybe learning difficulties, or maybe is suffering with a chronic illness and or has needed a lot of extra care and attention and time. Now, if you have a sibling who understandably needs that extra care and attention and time, it can sometimes mean that your needs, your feelings get overlooked because of your parents or caregivers have had to spend a lot of time looking after your sibling, and you've had to perhaps be more of the kind of good child who then doesn't speak up and kind of gets a little bit overlooked. And then the last one is when a child is shamed or made to feel wrong for feeling. So if you have been really shamed, you've been laughed at, you've been humiliated, you've been yelled at, you've been criticised for expressing your feelings, you'll become very, very scared of expressing feelings, and you will learn to hide your true feelings. It won't feel safe to be vulnerable. It won't feel safe to be your real self. And this is really all sort of down to kind of self-preservation. And as a child, you wouldn't have probably had the awareness or language to realise what was going on, but it will be very evident as you come into adulthood. You'll probably find it very, very hard to be open about your feelings because of feeling vulnerable does not feel safe for you. So additionally, although you might now be coping with your feelings a lot through food, through restriction, through binge eating, through overeating, through emotional eating, through over-exercising, through chewing and spitting, through taking diet pills or laxatives, you might be coping today through using disordered eating means. But in the past as well, a clue that you may have been struggling as a child with your emotions might be that you were using other coping strategies to try and gain a sense of control in your life. So these may be things like little obsessive rituals, maybe having to have everything in a certain order. You may have had to kind of count things. You may have felt very unsafe if there was change in your routine. You may have done things like hair pulling or face picking your nails, acting out, withdrawing from others, or maybe even using food as an emotional tool early on, even before it became an eating disorder. So, just reflect on that and notice if there are any clues from your childhood that you may have struggled with your emotions. Okay, time for a short advertisement break. Friends, does it feel like I'm okay until I'm stressed and I can't stop eating? Am I ever going to stop binging? I can't slow down or relax. I can't tell my hunger and fullness even though I think I'm eating enough. I'm fine with food till something happens and then I'm restricting emotional eating and not buying groceries again. I surround myself with body positive pictures, wearing more comfortable clothes, but still I can't stand my body and I fear gaining weight. So you do not lack knowledge. You may not just have had a sense of safety inside you for recovery efforts to fully land. This means you may be living in chronic fight, flight, freeze or please, and you need new experiences of the threat responses softening that cause the eating and body image issues in the first place so that recovery can actually stick. So if you are seeking the missing piece in your food, weight and health recovery journey, consider trauma-informed nutritional counselling with Tracy Brown and Associates. And Tracy can be reached at www.tracybrownrd.com/get-started. Link is in the show notes to learn how to shift what has been too much or not enough inside for food to feel easy. So the tricky thing is when you haven't had your emotional needs met, your ability to deal with your emotions effectively is quite compromised. So an eating disorder can become a way to cope with emotions consciously or unconsciously. Now, of course, this is a maladaptive and unhealthy coping strategy. In the short term, you'll probably find relief, and maybe you needed your eating disorder, initially as a way to survive when you were living in an emotionally difficult situation. So you need to be compassionate for yourself in a way. Like, the eating disorder has probably helped you through some really difficult times. However, if you continue using food or exercise for the longer term, it's going to create so many more problems for you and prevent you from leading your most fulfilled and peaceful life. And of course, we all want to be living in a place of greater peace, fulfillment, and feeling a bit more happy. So an important part of recovery can be working on your emotional intelligence. And sometimes this may need to be done as well in the safety of therapy. If the emotional world just feels all a bit too unsafe and scary and overwhelmingly vulnerable, it's completely a helpful thing to go for therapy or coaching or getting some professional support. However, it's also something you can work on yourself through slowing down day to day, increasing your self-awareness, becoming just more mindful of your thoughts and feelings, talking to friends, journaling, recording voice notes, reading books, listening to podcasts. All these things can massively help. So what do we mean by emotional intelligence? So this definition is from the Very Well Mind website. So emotional intelligence is the ability to perceive, interpret, demonstrate, control, evaluate, and use emotions to communicate with and relate to others effectively and constructively. This ability to express and control emotions is essential, but so is the ability to understand, interpret, and respond to the emotions of others. And some experts suggest that emotional intelligence is more important than IQ for success in life. I think that's something I would really agree with, actually. I have worked with many, many people who are incredibly intelligent people, been to Cambridge University, Oxford University, academically are at the top of their game, and you could probably almost label them as a genius. But because of perhaps things that have happened in their early life and not having their emotional needs met, they have really, really struggled with the emotional side of things. And then that has really impacted them, and prevented them fulfilling their full potential. They've often, because of perhaps they struggle so much with the pressure they put on themselves and the pressure they feel in relationships to please and be perfect, this has prevented them being able to kind of perhaps follow the job path they would like to do, or to be in relationships that are completely fulfilling, etc., etc. So what are some of the signs of being emotionally intelligent? So again, from the Very Well Mind website, an ability to identify and describe what people are feeling. And I've included here as well, I think it's really important as well to identify and describe what you are feeling. What are you personally feeling? An awareness of your personal strengths and limitations, self-confidence and self-acceptance, the ability to let go of mistakes, an ability to accept and embrace change, a strong sense of curiosity, particularly about other people, feelings of empathy and concern for others, showing sensitivity to the feelings of other people, accepting responsibility for mistakes, and the ability to manage emotions in difficult life situations. Now, I know when I was just kind of going through this list, I was reflecting a bit on my own journey here, and I'm sure many of you will relate to this. So I would say, like, on one level, I had quite good emotional intelligence. I was very good, really, at empathizing with others, picking up on their feelings. However, in terms of tuning into my own feelings, being able to name, process, and manage my feelings in a healthy way, that was a whole nother thing. So that might be something you relate to. So I know for me as a child, there was little emotional space at home to explore feelings. So my parents did have a lot going on emotionally, and they're very, very busy. My dad was managing a very, very busy farm. My mum had 4 children, was very involved as well with her extended family, and just incredibly overwhelmed a lot of the time. So I was often my mum's emotional supporter. So I would listen to all my mum's worries and be an emotional support for her, someone that she could talk to. And I also had several siblings, and I was the eldest, so it was tricky to get my needs met because I was the eldest and I was often like caring, looking after the others and looking after my mum, trying to kind of keep the peace, be the good girl. Now, I know for me, in certain situations where I did voice my emotions more assertively, it was often met by some people in the family with more disapproval and shaming. So I learned very early on that emotions felt quite dangerous and overwhelming, that they upset other people, they were burdensome to others. So I learned that it was really important to protect myself, not to show vulnerability, to be this kind of really coping good girl. So as a child, I was this perfect, pleasing, good child. And I was very attached as well to this role in the family. It was very safe and reassuring. I was seen as the responsible child who didn't create problems and was happy all the time. And, so in some ways I kind of got this approval and validation in the family for stepping into that role. But actually, it really did impact my mental well-being because of no human being is constantly happy and content and pleasing of others all the time. I did have my own emotions too. So I often hid my more difficult emotions. And as I came into adulthood and into sort of more adult relationships, this was extremely detrimental and was very sort of sabotaging and unhelpful and prevented me being able to kind of form intimate, close relationships with other people. So I would frequently people please, bury my feelings and keep going. Then what would often happen for me is one day all these niggling resentments and anger would come to the surface in one big uncontrollable spike. I'd have a major meltdown, and then I'd feel such shame and embarrassment for just completely losing it. Then everyone around me as well would be completely shocked and surprised as to kind of like, where did all these emotions come from, Harriet? You're normally the kind of happy, kind of perfect, pleasing person. So what I would tend to do is I would apologize then for having my outburst. I would then minimize all the feelings I had, push them to one side, bury them, carry on again, and very much use the eating disorder as the kind of outlet for all those emotions I was burying. Now, of course, the ED didn't resolve the problems or the issues that needed addressing. It was like plastering over a gaping wound. And I was just not giving myself any permission either to have my needs met. So I'm going to give you some examples as well as when I would bury my emotions. So for me, I would often feel very guilty and wrong for having emotions, particularly negative emotions, due to my childhood conditioning, when in fact, these emotions were little white flags guiding and helping me to know what needed changing in my environment, where I need to set boundaries or increase my level of self-care. So often I would find in relationships, close relationships, if the other person wanted me to do something and I didn't really want to do it, I would ignore that inner resistance I felt in my body. I would ignore that kind of disinterest, that slightly sinking feeling I would have in response to being asked to do something. I would just like push through that and I would probably just go along anyway. And then what would often happen is sometimes I would be able to kind of keep up the kind of happy coping front, but often my buried anger and resentment would sort of leak out in other ways. So I'd probably be a bit sort of passive aggressive, a bit moody, dragging my feet, not sort of totally present in the situation. Another example could be when I was at work, I would take on too much, feel exhausted and overwhelmed at the volume of everything I needed to do. But what I wouldn't do is I wouldn't communicate with my bosses and say, actually, look, I'm already doing A, B, C, D, and E. I haven't got room to do F, G, H, I, J or whatever. I would just keep pushing myself, and I'd actually feel quite inwardly angry and resentful towards the people around me who I wasn't communicating with, but I sort of perceived were kind of expecting me to do all of this because I wasn't setting any boundaries. And also, I'd often as well that push myself to a place where I'd almost get burnt out and then maybe have to take time off work to recover, rather than being able to set healthy boundaries in the first place. And another thing I would often do as well is I would often agree with someone in the moment. Like my default setting was always to say yes, not I will think about it, or to listen to my body and realize if there was a no there. So I would find it really, really hard to know what I felt about a situation. So I wouldn't even recognize I was people pleasing because my default mechanism was people pleasing. So if someone asked me something, I would just say yes without even thinking about it. So I could just be so easily swayed by anyone who was a bit louder, a bit more dominant, a bit more sure of themselves. And then, of course, again, I would secretly resent them and feel angry when in fact, actually, I just wasn't giving myself permission or taking responsibility and expressing my opinion. So giving myself permission to be heard and also giving that other person, a chance to gain awareness about how I was really feeling. So something that many of you may relate to, which is something that I really struggled with, is that a major barrier for me was dealing with the guilt that arose from having feelings. So I felt guilty for feeling because as a child, I hadn't had permission to have the full range of feelings. It only felt okay and permissible to be happy, cooperative, good, peaceful, etc. Now, when I reflect on my own childhood, I actually did have some permission to feel sadness, although I think I would often feel that if I was sad, I was burdening or overwhelming people and my sadness was a bit too much. But the main kind of emotions that I would really struggle to express were anything to do with kind of anger, fury, rage, disappointment. It felt very wrong and unsafe to go there. Now, another thing I think that put me off being able to express my anger is I very much associated anger as being a very negative thing, because I think some of my role models in my early life did express their anger in a very aggressive and quite terrifying way sometimes. And I always thought, gosh, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be that kind of angry, horrible person. And I think we often get confused there because I think often people don't express their anger in the most helpful way. Maybe they're kind of throwing things, they're yelling, they're being abusive, but actually there's nothing wrong with the feeling of anger. The feeling of anger in our body is a great sort of sign for us that our boundaries have been validated, that something is wrong, that there's a threat in the environment. And actually, if we can listen to that, signal in our body, it can really help us then to communicate kindly and assertively, to put a limit in place to look after ourselves. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with feeling angry. You don't need to feel guilty. So if you do feel guilty for having your emotions, really reflect on where this comes from and why this is so. Now, I know for me, what really helped with me is being able to recognize that feeling of guilt was not actually rooted in a healthy place. Now, obviously, guilt is helpful in some instances in life. It prevents us murdering people and, doing a whole manner of unhelpful things like that. However, feeling guilty for setting a boundary, looking after your needs, looking after yourself, that is not helpful. So what you can start to do is label that guilt as trauma guilt or unnecessary guilt. You don't have to feel guilty for feeling your feelings. How you feel is how you feel. I can just hear Bruce meowing, so I'm just going to pause this and let him in. Okay, so Bruce the cat is now safely in the room. Cats are funny, aren't they? He wants to crawl all over my laptop or sit on my laptop, so I cannot see what I'm trying to talk about. But of course, hey, the laptop is probably way more appealing and comfy than any other nice soft item in the room. So if you recognise that you're struggling with your emotions, tuning into them, feeling them, being in touch with them, processing them, etc., how do you begin to change this? Okay, so I think one of the things that is so helpful is just starting to slow down a bit in life. Okay, now I think in our very strivey society, we are often so busy. We are in fight, flight, or sort of striving, purpose-driven mode for most of the time. And we just don't have any gaps in the day to reflect and pause and tune in. Now, if you think about when you were a child, and this may not be true for all of you, anyone I think that had a very unsafe or traumatic childhood, you may not have had this in the same way. But I think hopefully for many of you listening, you will remember as a child perhaps being able to kind of daydream and just like be with your thoughts and, just having time to kind of reflect and think about things and use your imagination or get excited and being a bit more in tune with yourself. And I think often as adults, we lose this. We feel we have to be productive all the time. We're do. And we live life at such a fast pace. We cram in endless things to do from dawn until dusk. So one thing that's really helpful is just beginning to slow down a little bit. And I think you just have to start really small with this. So maybe it's doing something like if you're doing the washing up or hanging out the washing or another kind of task that you have to do, rather than listening to music or listening to a podcast or distracting yourself, actually to just be with your thoughts and just see where your mind wanders, because of anything that is emotionally kind of impacting you, those emotions will probably start to float to the surface when you allow yourself a little bit of time. It might be going on a walk without being plugged into anything. It could be journaling. Some people find it so much easier to get in touch with their thoughts and feelings when they start to write things down. And sometimes you may have no clue what you're really thinking or feeling. I know for myself sometimes I don't really know, and then I start writing things down and actually everything starts to flow and I start to get more clarity. Another way I find it's really helpful is speaking out loud. Now, this is definitely not for everyone, but I know for myself, if I record a voice note, I can always pretend I'm in a therapy session. I'm just voicing my own thoughts and feelings out loud. And I might just do this for like 10 minutes and then listen back to it. And it helps bring me so much clarity and understanding about what I'm struggling with, what I need to focus on, how I am genuinely feeling about something. It's so helpful. Another thing is to talk to a close friend. Now, ideally, if you've got someone in your life where there's that kind of reciprocal kind of sharing, listening, where you can take it in turns a bit to really support, accept and listen to one another. Now, I think again, people with eating disorders are often really good at listening to other people, being very empathetic, but they're not so good at talking about their own issues. Now, it's great to be a great listener and supporter of others, but you don't want to kind of use that as a way to never express your own vulnerability. I know for myself, sometimes in the past, it was a very safe space for me to be in, to be the kind of supporter, the listener person. And I would end up knowing way more about other people than they knew about me. But actually, that's not really that healthy for most of your relationships. Of course, like as a counsellor now, that is very important. I'm in that role where I am the listener and my client doesn't know everything about me. But in my close, intimate relationships, it's really important that it is two-way. So it's trying to carve out time to be in touch with your thoughts and feelings. And honestly, if you can get into the habit of finding a way that this works for you, whether it be through journaling, through speaking out loud, through talking to a friend, and if you do this regularly, you will reap so many benefits. Okay, now I've had a lot of therapy in the past, but in more recent years when I need to work on things, I tend to journal, speak out loud, talk to friends, slow down, do all the things. And actually, I would say I've probably made as much progress, if not more, when I've been really working on myself in a very proactive way than when I was going to therapy for an hour a week. Because actually, you can be with yourself at any moment, at any time. And if you start to carve out time every day, you're going to see exponential progress with that. Okay. So, slowing down. Okay, if you feel that you are quite emotionally illiterate, if you feel like your emotions consist of fine, bad, not much else, you can go onto Google and type in emotions wheel, and you can download an emotions wheel which lists all kinds of different emotions that a human can feel, and you can start to use this as a tool to check in with yourself. So you could maybe, when you're doing your journaling, you could just look at the wheel and think, actually, which emotions have I been feeling in the last 24 hours, in the last few days? Just starting to help yourself become more emotionally literate. And if you find it very hard to name the feeling, notice the sensations in your body. Okay, so, Often people, if they're feeling sad, might feel a real kind of heaviness in their chest and maybe in their stomach area. If you're feeling anxious, you probably feel like a tightness in your body, probably feel like, your jaw is clenched, your shoulders are clenched. You might have, if you're really feeling very, very nervous, you might have like butterflies in your stomach. If you're feeling angry, you might have this kind of bubbling kind of energy sort of searing up from inside you. I know if I'm angry, I can almost feel like it's like a real kind of energy rising up sort of through my chest, and can feel it in my whole body. So again, you may just be very out of touch with these feelings. If you're using food, over-exercise, binge eating, restricting, any of the disordered eating behaviours, you may be very distracted from your feelings because you're thinking about food and exercise and all the things instead. So learning to just tune into your feelings and to just recognise how you're feeling is the first step. Okay, and I think the helpful thing as well is to realise you don't have to be ruled by your feelings. Okay, I think in the course of a day sometimes we can feel numerous different feelings, and they're often like little waves that can kind of ebb and flow. And sometimes it's just tuning in and noticing. I know sometimes, probably every week, I'll have a little cry about something. I can't even remember now what I cry about, but something will touch me, and it's just usually a few moments. And it doesn't mean that I'm then kind of sad and overwhelmed and something terrible in my life is happening, and that it's this overwhelming feeling, but it's just like that gentle release, which is just really helpful, and just helps you kind of tune in and feel better. And once you have identified the feeling, ask yourself questions like, what is it that I need right now? How can I take care of myself? Because I think often, if we're feeling sad, if we're feeling anxious, or we're feeling angry, you might be so used to numbing it by either not eating or eating too much or going and doing exercise, when actually probably what you need is something else. So sometimes if you feel sad, maybe you need to talk to someone. If you're feeling angry, maybe you need to communicate with someone and let them know a boundary, or, let them know what's troubling you. If you're feeling anxious, maybe you need to just sort of take a step back and think, am I sort of catastrophizing this? Is this a kind of realistic fear? Just to approach it with some kind of calmness and rationalization. Maybe you need to kind of journal on it. Maybe you need to take some rest. Maybe you need to kind of go out for a walk, do an activity that's self-caring. There could be numerous ways of taking care of yourself without using food. So how else can you achieve the need? How else can you soothe that emotion without using food? And in the early stages, you might really struggle with this. You might not know where to begin. That is normal. You've got to be really kind and compassionate with yourself and realise, I'm learning a new skill. This is difficult work, but I'm going to learn. I'm a resourceful, resilient person. I've learned many other things in life, and this is just another thing I am learning. So some common coping strategies for dealing with emotions. So it could be reaching out to a friend. I know for myself, if I'm going through something that's quite emotionally turbulent in my life, I will speak to one or two close people in my life, okay? And I don't need them to fix it. I don't need them to tell me what to do. I just need them to listen, and that is really helpful. Sometimes it could be having a hug if you're a huggy person. I know for myself, actually, I'm not a very huggy person, but I know for a lot of people, having a hug, having some affectionate physical contact can be really, really helpful. You could write down your feelings in a journal, or use like an app to kind of express your feelings out loud. You could go for a walk, have a change of scene. You could do breathing or meditation. You could do something that's kind to yourself and relaxing. Now, I know there's a lot of trending at the moment on TikTok and sort of like social media in general about romanticizing your life. And a lot about this is just like really bringing yourself back to the present moment. So, for example, if you're going to have your breakfast in the morning, rather than kind of rushing around the kitchen, or missing breakfast and eating it standing up, dashing out the door, kind of like no self-care involved at all. Maybe you take 10 minutes and you set yourself a place, you put some music on, you light a candle, you have a few moments to really enjoy that moment and bring yourself back to the present. Now, I get if you've got kids, you've got a busy life, that's not always going to be realistic, but I think we can all take time to calm out little moments, even if we can't do it like consistently or quite as much as we would like to. So if you're feeling really angry, you might need to kind of get that anger moving through you. So you might want to punch a cushion, or express your anger outwards in a safe way. Maybe again you're writing it down in your journal, or maybe you need to go out into the middle of a field and have a good shout. I think it's really good for our anger to move through us, because when your anger gets trapped in the body, when you're not expressing it, can lead to all kinds of things. And a lot of people might experience kind of physical conditions when they're holding a lot of their emotions inside. It could be communicating assertively with someone about your needs. So like setting that boundary, explaining, actually, no, I'm really sorry, I can't come to that event that you're organising. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'd love to come again, but, I just can't come on this occasion. And maybe sometimes as well, it's just having a day where you haven't got loads of things planned, where you can just potter around and be with yourself and have some calm and soothing and downtime. Now, I know for me, this is one of the most helpful things for me to do. Like, I'm not someone that functions well if I'm constantly overstimulated and over busy. Like, for me, it's quite heavenly, really, to have a day where I can perhaps just do a little bit of work. I'm just pottering around, maybe I'm cleaning out the fridge or something. I'll tell you what, I'm not very hot on cleaning out my fridge, but it's doing the little kind of tasks. It's maybe like going out for coffee. It's maybe just doing the little things, like maybe sitting down and watching a bit of YouTube. Maybe it's like taking time to prepare a nice dinner. Maybe it's just like sitting with one of my children, playing a game or something. But it's just like slowing everything down, just being much more present and in the moment. And I find if I have a day like that, it massively resets me and helps me and just makes me feel much more resourceful and resilient. Now, because of the short-term fix that food can offer in numbing, soothing or distracting, it's very typical that you might feel some ambivalence about not using food to regulate your emotions. Now, this is very normal because nothing else is going to feel as good as food to start with. And it might feel very unsafe and uncomfortable, maybe, having to reach out to someone, because I know a lot of people say to me, food is the one thing in my life that I can control, and I don't want to let go of that, because in a way it's the one thing that is mine and mine alone. Okay, so if you feel that, you're not alone. Okay, but there are so much more healthy ways to cope, and you can still sometimes use food emotionally to cope. Do you know what I mean? We're not saying you can never ever use food emotionally, because food is soothing and that's okay. You just want to have alternative tools as well in the bag. So also, if you're prone to using food to numb your emotions, you may also use other ways of coping. So you might use alcohol, you might overwork, you might do like online shopping. All of these things could be other ways of escaping your emotions. If you notice yourself here, try not to judge yourself. Just be aware of the patterns that you fall into. And in the early stages of this work, you might feel that your emotions are all over the place. Now, I know a client I've worked with recently who did some amazing work on recovery and, but got to a place where emotions were just really just coming in quite intensely after being starved for a very long time. And it was just so overwhelming and triggering. And, this person found it very hard to then keep going down the recovery road because it just felt too much. And I think we need to really normalise this stage of emotions being overwhelming, okay? Eating disorder recovery is messy, it is overwhelming, it's okay though. You're going to get through this. Through the messy, difficult times, you're going to learn so much about yourself, you're going to be much more in tune with yourself, you're going to understand the areas of your life maybe where people have been taking you for granted, where you've not been happy, and actually tuning into those emotions, you're suddenly in touch with this valuable internal barometer that can guide you so well so you can make better decisions, and for the longer term you can feel so much more at peace. Okay, so to begin with, you might find surges of emotion feeling a bit overwhelming and uncomfortable. You might feel scared or angry at yourself for feeling emotions, and you might want to direct them inwards by self-punishing. But work not to do this, and seek support if you really find yourself kind of, going back down this loop. And just to say to you as well is, when you're in a more healthy place with your emotions, you will find they become much less overwhelming, People that experience really intense, overwhelming emotions are usually the people that are suppressing them for half the time. So when they finally have a release of emotion, it's like a volcano erupting. When you're in touch with your emotions day by day, they're more like little waves and they feel much more manageable. So, some final points. Everybody feels the whole range of emotions at different points, okay? However perfect someone's life looks on social media, or if you think someone around you is always happy, they are not, okay? Everyone has the whole range of emotions. And you can make your emotional life much easier if you're taking care of yourself with the basics of self-care. So staying hydrated, eating regularly, managing alcohol, getting good sleep, all those things. That's going to help massively, okay? Because of if you're hungry, if you're hungover, if you're sleep deprived, you're not going to be in a good place with your emotional regulation. And your ability to regulate your emotions as well will be compromised when your self-care levels are low. So if you're overworking, if you're not taking time for yourself, you're going to feel irritable and overwhelmed by your emotions. You're not wrong for having emotions, and also you don't have to be ruled by your emotions. Your emotions are an internal barometer that can guide you, but you can choose how you're going to respond to those emotions, okay? So you can be in a healthy relationship with your emotions. It doesn't mean that by allowing your emotions in that you're going to be suddenly ruled by them and taken over by them. So really have a think about how you're doing emotionally. How are you self-caring apart from eating? If you don't have strategies in place, what could you do? How could you as well involve other people more in your life? And I'm talking about trusted, supportive people where you can open up and really be listened to. Do you need to invest in therapy or coaching or seeing a professional? Can you talk more to your friends? And can you use tools and things like journaling or speaking out loud or, going for walks, carving out time every day so you can tune more into your emotions? Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you are not following me on Instagram, do seek me out at the eating disorder therapist _ For further support with your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. If you're a professional listening to this and you are new to eating disorders, you may be interested in my eating disorders training day for professionals, which is now on Zoom. Go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk to find out more information, and also the link will be in the show notes. Okay, and thank you so much for listening, and I will be releasing another podcast episode for you very soon, and I think I will definitely be doing at least a part 3, if not a part 4 or even 5 on this psychological mindset side of things. Okay, thanks for listening. Bye for now.